Welcome back, everyone. Last week we were thinking about Abraham and Isaac. This week, something a bit less personal in the sense it's not a one-to-one story, it's more a mass extermination story. So thinking about genocide, whether God actually commands genocide in the Old Testament. There are a number of places that we could look for that. And I've chosen 3 readings this evening, 2 from Deuteronomy and 1 from 1 Samuel. So I wonder if someone, possibly Harley, possibly someone else, would be willing to read Deuteronomy 7.
Only if nobody else wants to, then I'll go ahead. I'll just let my nose.
That's great, Harley, thank you.
Leave it up there.
Yes. So Deuteronomy 7. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are about to enter and occupy, and he clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations mightier and more numerous than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must utterly destroy them. Make no covenant with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for that would turn away your children from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But this is how you must deal with them. Break down their altars, smash their pillars, hew down their sacred poles, and burn their idols with fire. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on earth to be his people, his treasured possession. Oh my.
And then a few chapters on in Deuteronomy, just to underline that this isn't one random aberration in the Old Testament. Are you happy to read that?
Yeah, absolutely. But as for the towns of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you must not let anything that breathes remain alive. You shall annihilate them, the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, just as the Lord your God has commanded, so that they may not teach you to do all the abhorrent things that they do for their gods, and you thus sin against the Lord your God. Ooh. Well,
and finally,
1 Samuel.
1 Samuel 15.
Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish the Amalekites for what they did in opposing the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.
Blimey.
So how do you react to those passages? They're not ones, I guess, we often read in church. They'll be, for the lectionary, if you follow the lectionary, they'll be carefully edited out of the readings. But how do you react to them? What's your immediate feeling when you hear those words?
Horrified, absolutely horrified. Terrible, terrible. So what sort of things were they doing? Were they worshipping lots of other gods? What were they doing that was so wrong? Peter?
The feeling seems to be, I think, that it's the worship of other gods that's the problem. And it's this sense that somehow if you're going to have a pure worship of the one God, you need to get rid of all it's like a contamination.
So
and
sorry, these would be idols, were they? They're just worshipping idols or just
yes. Yeah. So, I mean, to jump ahead a bit, it is a form of genocide in the sense that if you think of the arguments that the Nazis advanced against the Jews for the Holocaust, it was very much about the Jews were presented as some sort of pestilence or some sort of plague or some sort of contamination. So it actually does lend itself very well, as we'll see, to that sort of attitude toward the other. And I'm jumping ahead a bit, but I think it bears saying, even at this early stage, that actually, if that's the thinking behind them, that's how they've come to be used in subsequent instances. Any other reactions? By the way, Vaughan, was somebody trying to get in? I saw
Neil.
That's Nick, lovely. Yeah, I saw an admit thing, but I didn't get a chance to click on it and then it disappeared, but you obviously let him in. Thank you. Any other reactions? I mean, how familiar are you with these passages? Were they a shock, or were you familiar with them but just didn't really want to think about them too much?
Yeah, I'm familiar with them. I'm familiar with them. Yeah, and I've tended not to think about overthink, about it, but at the same time, it's quite important to address it and sort of find some kind of way of dealing with it. But yeah, I've never really tried. So,
no, don't worry. I mean, I think most people are in that position.
yeah.
It's one of the embarrassing bits of the Bible that we tend to sort of.
Yes, I mean it is very hard line. I mean, and even so, and one of the transitions that it makes is going from the idea that these people do these awful things, namely worshipping false gods, and and because of that, you should exterminate entire races. All these tribes or races or whatever they, like you want to call them. So that is sort of sneakily presupposing that every member of that sort of tribe is culpable and guilty, and it extends not only to the adults but to the infants and children that had just been born, and to their domestic animals. So it's tremendously wide-ranging.
That's a very good point, and that's what's really frightening, isn't it? That it's indiscriminate.
Your material, Peter, suggests role playing, and I wonder if it could be an idea to role play some of this passage.
Good idea to what? I didn't quite catch that. Sorry.
Role play. Yes.
No, that's a very good point. Yes.
Now or later, don't mind.
Yeah. No. I mean, it would be interesting to think about. Well, actually, if you look at the original booklets that I wrote,
yes,
I suggested that you could allocate the roles of hearer, and then a hero, but dissenter, and a victim, and have a conversation about the stories, and that's really good.
Yeah, I read that. Yes.
Because I mean, a question we could ask ourselves: if we were told that God was commanding us to do this, would we follow the command?
Exactly.
Or would we challenge it?
Yeah, I'll be the victim.
Yeah. Like when I was at a bibliodrama session on the wise and foolish virgins, and I think I mentioned last week, I chose to be a victim in that role play because I wanted to explore why the others felt it was okay to shut me out and not to lend me any of their oil. And exactly the same way, I would want to ask why these people felt it was right and acceptable to kill me just because I believe something different.
I think when I read it, I mean, the two things in my mind. One was that it's such a contemporary kind of issue in relationship to Israel-Palestine.
Yes.
And so you can sort of read it in very kind of contemporary terms. And that's kind of frightening because, particularly for Christians, we're in this kind of double bind, where we have a role in history in relationship to Israel, which is not positive, and also we have a role in solidarity with
people of Palestine. So that I think the difficulty of the story for me is the difficulty of the contemporary situation. But the other thing I found really interesting in my own reaction was last week when we read the story of Abraham and Isaac. I had this kind of feeling that although this story begins in a terrible, kind of way, that you could see it's leading to some kind of redemptive, position. So you can see that there's a transformation taking place within the story, and the boy is not killed. So that there's something behind this story that you can sort of tease out. But with these, I mean, I find it really hard to see anything that could come out of this that was good. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And and also supposing that, I mean, it's very rare to have a situation like this where there were sort of numerous religious practices, and it's very rare to find people who only do one lot of them and don't do any of the others at all. I think we'd come out, fairly badly because, everybody has, does things at, well, Christmas time, for example, which are not exactly in the Bible, and which probably have roots in, some sort of religious practices which aren't rooted in Christianity. So would we all be for the choppers?
Yeah.
For the things we did at Christmas time.
Yeah, no, that's a very sobering thought, actually, isn't it? Yes, it's not. Things that
people shouldn't kiss under the mistletoe, Graham.
Sorry?
You missed that, I think.
So if these passages weren't in the Bible, suppose they're in another sacred book, would you react to them the same way? I mean, I guess if we read them in the Quran, we'd be very disturbed, and probably make more of it, I suspect.
The justification of these passages that I've heard in the past is we don't have to do this now because of Jesus. So it's showing us what we don't have to do, which is a very weak argument, isn't it?
I mean, the problem with that argument is it sort of seems to present God as changing God's mind, because us needing to do them, but it's whether God actually wanted us to do them X thousand years ago, but wouldn't dream of asking us to do them now.
Is it weaponization of text? The quotes, do you think?
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, they certainly have been weaponized, and I'll give some examples of that in a minute. So that's very, very true. I mean, there is a position, and there is a book called Show Them No Mercy, which has 4 different views of divine genocide, largely from an evangelical perspective, and it ranges from the view that says, well, it happened then, but God would want it to happen now, but it did actually genuinely happen then, but God doesn't work in the same way now, to a view that says it didn't happen even then, and God has never wanted that.
Sorry, you also mentioned in your text that they might not necessarily be true, these quotes in the Bible.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not necessarily right.
No, I mean, there's considerable debate about what actually happened in the Exodus, and whether it was a genocidal occupation of land, or whether it was much more gradual, and there's much more coexistence. Yeah. So it could be that some of these passages are actually trying to make a point about the wrongness of the other religions and how God stands against them, but not necessarily reflecting true things that actually happened, but still the sentiment behind them is still implying that God wanted these things to happen, whether they actually did happen or not. And there is one instance where they're told off for not doing this.
The other argument I'd heard is that the stories are redacted after the exile, so that they are there to kind of legitimize the returning exiles to Israel, to legitimize the claim that Israel had on the land that they were returning to.
Yeah.
I think the problem is, and I mentioned this in the third point there, that obviously one of the big themes of the Old Testament is the Exodus. And it is pretty central, not just to the Old Testament, also to Christian faith. But when we think of Easter, a lot of traditions make a big thing of Exodus. And if you've ever been to an Easter Vigil service on a Saturday evening, there's a big emphasis on this being the Christian version of the Exodus. But as one of my students once said when I was teaching Old Testament and teaching about the Exodus, and what a significant theme it was, both in Judaism and in Christianity. And she just simply said, well, yeah, but what about the Canaanites? What about the people who were displaced because of the Exodus? And I think that's the broader question of this, that even when we talk about the Exodus, which is a very positive and dynamic Christian theme, there is a flip side to that. There are victims of that. And those are the Canaanites, and they're the ones who are displaced. So again, it raises questions, I think, that are worth thinking about how we think about the Exodus, how we preach or teach about it if we're in that position, but how we think about it and how we talk about it. But even the Exodus has victims.
I mean, even going back to Graham's point earlier about, no one is spared. Even before the Exodus starts, the plagues in Egypt are very uncomfortable, aren't they? Because they're fairly indiscriminate. All the children who are killed. So I don't quite know what's going on with that either. I've always found that uncomfortable.
It's a bloody mess, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, it's really. If I was writing a Bible, I wouldn't write it like this.
I think the interesting thing is that these concerns that we have are fairly recent concerns, because as you'll see, the Bible's certainly been used, and these stories have been used to justify all sorts of things in history. And I think it's only really in the last 100 years or so that we've become sensitized to actually what's going on here and how morally wrong it is. Let's look at one or two quotes that you may find interesting. The full references are in the booklet, as I said last week, and the booklet's available on the website to download. Oliver Cromwell drew a parallel between his revolution and the Exodus, and treated the Catholics of Ireland as the Canaanites, and declared that there are great occasions in which some men are called to great services, in the doing of which they are excused from the common rule of morality, as were, he said, the heroes of the Old Testament. So pretty much a carte blanche there. If there are occasions when you can actually ignore morality, the common rule of morality, then actually anything goes. And that's interesting, and I'm sure he's not the only one who's justified.
Well, we Congregationalists are brought up with Oliver Cromwell as our great hero.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes, great. So,
Grief. Well, he must have had more justification than that. There must have been. He must have. How does anyone decide when it's a great enough occasion to ignore morality? Who makes that decision? And obviously he did with the civil war with Ireland, but what gave him that right or that reason? Or I know we probably don't want to talk about Oliver Cromwell in too much detail because it's off the point, but how does anyone justify that?
Maybe one justifies it to start with by, once one sees that the Catholics of Ireland or whoever are actually the Canaanites in this scenario.
Okay, yeah.
You've got a warrant for it, because I'm basically doing in this time to these people what the biblical heroes did in their time to those people. So I think it's
purging false gods. Yeah.
Sorry?
Purging false gods.
Okay.
And another example, this is from a book 3 years ago, Valerie and I went on holiday to Namibia. Had a lovely time, and I did a bit of reading around Namibia, and the genocide that went on in Namibia, where the indigenous peoples were killed by the Germans as colonists in the early 20th century. That's widely seen as a precursor to the Holocaust of the Second World War. And this book is a novel about that, which is notable for quotes like the one I'm there in blue, but significant that a special edition I read somewhere was printed by the Nazis for their soldiers during World War II as a sort of, again, a reminder, supposedly, that what they were doing had some sort of divine commendation. So in this book, he writes, these blacks, that's the people of Namibia, have deserved death before God and man because they have built no houses and dug no wells. God has let us conquer here because we are the nobler and more advanced people. To the nobler and more vigorous belongs the world. That is the justice of God. And it's not a million miles from that to what we've been reading just now from Deuteronomy and 1 Samuel. Once you decide God is on your side.
Yeah. I went to a seminar earlier today as part of something called the Yorkshire Festival of Stories. It's a lot of which is online and free, by the way, so it's worth checking out their website. And it was called the Black Mountain Project, and they're basically a network of artists around the world who are looking at what's happening with climate change and how we react and so on. And there is a link. They believe that actually the problem isn't the Industrial Revolution, it goes further back than that. As soon as civilization started to subjugate Earth to its own purposes, it lost sight of what Earth was for and our partnership and our interrelationship with it. And so, it strikes me here that even, the guy here is talking about no houses, no wells. Well, possibly they were doing the right thing, much as Native Americans had done in, the States before that was conquered by white people. It was right for them not to do that. And actually the problem is civilization since, which ultimately, has at its center that the earth is there to serve people, because civilization can't exist any other way. And I found that really quite mind-blowing and interesting. They go right back to the Greeks and the Romans and say the problem started there. Therefore that's including things like we're reading here in the Old Testament, because the whole thing about purifying, and like Cromwell was doing in Ireland, the whole thing about purifying the nations they were going into was they're killing the livestock as well. They're literally cleansing, scorched earth policy in effect, everything that's there because it needs to serve them. Things that were there before can't be part of their life because it doesn't serve them. You can't go in and find things out. You can't discover what this country is about. And the Black Mountain Project is all about these people living in wilderness areas, well, some of them, and seeking not to disturb the wilderness, but to allow the wilderness to exist and for people to exist as a part of it. So it seems to me related. I know that's probably because they come on the same day for me, but I think the seminar was recorded as well, so you'd probably be able to listen to it on the website. As I say, it's the Yorkshire Festival of Stories, but I think there's something in that, isn't there? Obviously, they're not talking about it from a Christian basis, but that doesn't matter as far as I'm concerned.
There's something there in the sense that what we're talking about here is exactly the opposite of that. It's this sense that actually, as you say, the world or this particular part of the world is only for us. So any other person's claim on it in any other sense has to be removed. And when you were saying that, I thought actually the term ethnic cleansing is exactly the right term to describe what's going on here in the Old Testament. It is a form of cleansing. It's not just that we want to defeat these people. It's like a purification. We want to completely purify the land from them.
Your paper talked a bit about Rwanda, and the man who sort of began the awful talk. There was a preacher who told them to go out and kill all the Jews. It's the right thing to do. And he was a preacher man.
Yes.
I think often the trouble is preacher men are the problem. Sorry, boy.
No.
But, you know, people, especially men, men sometimes have so much power.
Yes.
Power. Just tell these people to go because God said so. And it's so wrong. Sorry, got carried away.
And the quote that you're referring to, I think it is this one, and this is a sermon preached,
Yeah.
and it won't be the only one. I mean, the frightening thing is it wasn't just one or two pastors, it was
Yeah,
quite a lot of them, I think. He compared the Tutsis to the Amalekites and said Saul was rejected by God because he failed to exterminate all of the Amalekites. That's one of the other passages I could have chosen. That doesn't just say that God told them to do this, but God told them off for not doing it. He said, if you don't exterminate the Tutsis, you'll be rejected. If you don't want to be rejected by God, then finish the job of killing the people God has rejected. No child, no wife, no old man should be left alive. And the people said, Amen. And sadly, as we know, the people went out and did it. It's just horrendous. And it's in our own lifetime and it's in our own experience that this has happened. The Old Testament has been quoted to justify it. So even if Cromwell seems a long time ago, even if German colonization of Namibia seems a long time ago, this is within the last 20 or 30 years. And it raises the question for me whether there are ways in which we ourselves, both in church and in society, create an other in the way that preacher has with the Tutsis, and how where otherness can lead us. So I wonder if there are ways we can think of in which we, either in society or even in the church, create an other with all that implies and potentially leads to.
Yeah. It's very difficult when you meet somebody who you know is very different from you. We go past an old man, looks like he's come out of the Bible every day when we come back from Union Chapel. He's sitting there begging, and we sort of, have we got a penny? Have we got a coin we could give him? We only had £10 note. Well, I don't know about £10 note. That seems a bit much. Okay, so we handed it to him. He said, hot meal at last, thank you so much. Maybe cheese. But phew. Something's going to have a good day. I don't know if that's anything to do with this. I just thought about it.
I think the key thing, what you said, Sue, is meet someone. If you meet someone, you can't carry on with an attitude of I'm just going to exterminate them. When humanity meets humanity, that just goes. It's when we don't meet, it's when we're separate, it's when we judge from a distance, in whatever way that is. However we categorize people, that's when we can, whether literally or virtually, exterminate them. And that's the core. Surely that's what church should be, the place where we meet.
I'm wondering whether this is a story of othering, whether it's more a question of sharing space, because I think, the Rwanda situation was infinitely more complex than it's told. And it wasn't just a spontaneous group of one tribe rising up against another. It was infinitely more complicated than that. Really what it was about was power and how to share space equitably between people. And I think it's the same situation here is, the Canaanites, the Israelites want to move into this space. They need a space, same as today, the Israelites want to move into this space. How do you share it? And I think, the kind of Palestine-Israel situation is trying to find this two-state solution, which is kind of almost impossible to achieve. Why not a one-state solution? One person, one vote. And I think similarly, this is what happened in Northern Ireland as well. How do Catholics and Protestants share space? And and they couldn't share space while the Catholics had no votes, where they had no human rights. They're in a much different situation now because that has changed. It's not perfect. It's not resolved properly, but they're in a different place because certain rights have been given to Catholics were not there in the 1970s.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it.
I mean, if we look around this country at the moment, you've got the whole immigration question, and that's about the shared space, whether there can be a shared space for both, well, for both parties in that. And even in the church, there are issues of shared space. Can there, as we endlessly hear in the Anglican communion, can there be a shared space for those who support the ordination of women, those who don't, those who are pro-LGBT, those who aren't? And there's endless debates about whether that space in the church can be shared. So I think that's a really helpful term, really, shared space. And that just causes so many of our problems, and goes right back, as you say, to these stories. It's whether there can be a shared space.
And I'd argue that language is a vital part of that, the way we use language. You know, the language that is used here is of these not even really being people.
Yeah.
You know, they're not, there's no personality attributed to them. They're called the Canaanites. You know, and you know, it's a tiny example perhaps, but you know, the whole idea of migration, one thing I find absolutely abhorrent and winds me up every time I hear it, and it's lazy reporting and it's lazy politics, or maybe it's more deliberate than that, is that there is no such thing as illegal migration. Migration is not an illegal act. It's a human right, but we hear it all the time, and it just gets in subliminally. And as soon as you attach that word to a group of people and identify them with that language, then you've othered them, haven't you, in another way? Because we're not illegal. You know, we're legal. We're okay. They're illegal. You know, people even say the illegals, don't they? Don't even now use migrant. And it's that the church has to be alive to resisting.
Yes. Yes.
Language is so vital.
Because they don't have a voice often, do they?
Yeah, exactly. We are their voice.
Yes.
So it's ways in which the church can actually help create that shared space.
Yeah.
Help us all move towards sharing space. That's a really helpful sort of image to sort of have in sense that addresses all of this in the real world.
Well, housing as well in this country. So space, people don't have space. They have to, so many children.
I think, yeah. And I think one of the really, you know, terrible things that's happening with our talk about the religions and ethnicities is that even the, you know, the various Christian denominations can't really let each other in. You know, and particularly when you talk of, you know, when the Anglicans keep saying the church, and half of the time it means the Church of England, and half of the time it means the, you know, the Church Universal, and it's just, you know, and there's always a lot of I mean, you know, we're no better. We certainly have historically been no better. But you know, the idea of having you know, a church which allows for diversity and which isn't, you know, bound together by you know, by social structures, but is bound together merely by the fact of being Christians, or, you know, merely by the fact of being religious, regardless of what that might, you know, what bedfellows that might end you up with. But it's something that, you know, the religious people have, I think, you know, done very badly at.
Yeah. Yeah, we need to start sharing our own space before we start people about sharing space.
Yes.
A couple of other comments. Rachel Held Evans was wrote some brilliant books. She died tragically young. I mean, only in her 30s, I think it was, 2 or 3 years ago. But very, very good books. If I sort of recommend all of them if you get a chance to read them. But she raises the question here, which I think is the pertinent question, really. If the slaughter of Canaanite children elicits only a shrug, then why not the slaughter of Pequots, of Syrians, of Jews? If we train ourselves not to ask hard questions about the Bible, then where will we find the courage to challenge interpretations that justify injustice? How will we know when we got it wrong? So in other words, unless we question these texts that really we don't believe are moral or right, then how are we going to question situations where they're misused? So we need to ask questions. We need to raise these questions, lest the texts start being used in ways which are life-destroying and we're not actually in position to respond to them. And just a bit of reassurance that even within the tradition itself, there are misgivings. According to Jewish Midrash, and that's the sort of informal commentaries that the rabbis write on passages of the Hebrew Bible. Well, according to one interpretation, the angels who sought to sing a hymn to God as the Egyptians were drowning as they unsuccessfully tried to cross the Red Sea, were rebuked by God, who said, "While my creatures are drowning in the sea, you would sing a hymn." So even in the Jewish tradition, there are questionings about some of these things in the Hebrew Bible. There may be other examples, but this is quite a well-known example that I wanted to flag up. So even in the tradition itself, there's a sense in which actually, that it isn't right to celebrate this death, because these are God's people too.
I think, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, when you started, you said these passages were almost certainly left out of the lectionary, certainly the Sunday lectionary, and that we would play them down. And you take something like the Exodus story. I mean, it becomes a metaphor, and it's repeated. It appears in the prophets. It appears in the Gospels. It's resonances in Paul and Hebrews and all the way through. So the theme of the liberation runs through, but the theme of genocide and extermination doesn't.
No,
it's not taken up. So you kind of almost feel as if in itself the Bible is itself editing itself. It is sort of determining and saying which bits are more important than others, and which bits are the real bits that you focus on, and it's at the end of the day, the Bible primarily is saying the liberation is the key focal point, not the conquering.
that's a good point. Yes.
Which is the Midrashic interpretation. I mean, is sort of almost kind of implicit in the Bible itself.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yes, because you don't see constant references in the New Testament, for example, to genocide. You may see references to the Exodus in general terms, not in.
Although there are some stuff in the Psalms, aren't there?
Yes. Yes. No.
And Pharaoh's army was drowned. Great is his love without end.
And I mean, the biggest argument, the most helpful point I've read about the Psalm, where it talks about it, if only your children were dashed against the rocks, is
137.
Is that that's not God commanding that. That's what somebody's feeling. And if we look around our world today, that's how some people will be feeling now. And the Bible doesn't commend it, but it understands it. And I thought that was really helpful. So maybe when we read Psalm 137, it doesn't invite us to feel the same, but it invites us to try and understand how somebody might be at the absolute depths of experience where they feel that.
And if you work with torture victims, you've got to hear that voice.
Yes.
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 Before there can be any healing,
Yes. As we get sort of toward the the end. This quote I found from John J. Collins, who's an American biblical scholar, I thought was really, really helpful, and I thought it sort of fitted in well here, really. The Bible has contributed to violence in the world precisely because it's been taken to confer a degree of certitude that transcends human discussion and argumentation. Perhaps the most constructive thing a biblical critic can do toward lessening the contribution of the Bible to violence in the world is to show that certitude is an illusion. And I thought that was really helpful and something that is worth reflecting about more here and perhaps after the session.
Mm.
I think it was Sue mentioned preachers, male preachers, and some of the most dangerous preaching can be preaching that is absolutely full of certitude.
Happens a lot.
Certitude can be a very dangerous thing. I mean, it can be very, very hopeful and uplifting if it's certitude about good things, but certitude very easily lends itself to certitude about judgment and about violence and about destruction.
I'm gonna make a controversial point here.
Oh,
It's very unlike me, but I think preaching has no place in the modern church. I think teaching has a place in the modern church, but not preaching. We need to stop talking at people, because preaching leads to certitude, but teaching doesn't. Teaching questions. Teaching leads to questions, and I'm uncomfortable with preaching, and I'm being deliberately naughty, but what I mean by preaching is what you basically said. When someone stands up with great certitude and tells you exactly what the Bible says, and then there's good old. I've had a go once where you preach in a Methodist chapel where you're 6 feet above contradiction. It's wonderful, isn't it? So you can say anything you like, really, and it's taken as absolutely right because you're in that pulpit. But that's what I think we need to stop. That's the way churches have been built, but they haven't been built by God to be like that. If you want to go right back to the fundamentals, it's not what God did. It's what we did to reinforce authority. And I think we need to stop doing that. I think we should be teaching people how to question, not preaching at them what it definitely says.
Paul's a very good person for preaching and teaching in the service. He's brilliant.
Well, I'd say Vaughan doesn't preach, Vaughan teaches. So you go.
Exactly. Exactly.
Whew.
So you're off the hook, Vaughan.
Thank you.
He says with great humility.
I'm hoping to come along on Sunday, Vaughan, because we're in London again at the weekend.
Oh, great.
So another chance to
right.
hear your teachings.
Yes.
I mean, do you have a reaction in terms of, as a regular preacher, Vaughan, to what Neil's just said?
Yeah, I think, well, over, when being old, when he started, I mean, a sermon would be 35 minutes, and mine are now sort of between 10 and 15, and I think you have to locate it in the liturgy overall, and allow that moment to move the liturgy from Bible reading, from gathering to Bible reading to a reflection on that, then into prayer and responses. And if those responses are musical or poetic or meditative or prayer or whatever, then actually you haven't preached at people, you've given ideas to people, and then you've given them space to make them their own.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I totally agree with you, Neil. And I preach sort of 3 or 4 times a year in our church here.
Oh.
And my view for a long time about preaching has been that it's about raising questions and helping people to find their own answers, not about telling them what their answers should be.
Exactly.
Because and I mean, I'm primarily a teacher, I guess. That's why I find it very difficult to be certain about anything.
Yeah, exactly. Same here.
That'll probably be a frustration sometimes when I'm up front, but I think it's so important that you actually give people the space to think things through for themselves.
Yeah.
But how to do that?
I do think also that there's a responsibility to talk about what the Bible, to do some teaching about the Bible, because
Yes.
People don't know the Bible anymore. So, you know, once upon a time, people would know what you were talking about, and a lot of people just don't know the Bible. And the other is that it's so easy to be locked into imperialist interpretation of Scripture, as we've seen here. You know, this passage we've seen now is ideal for empire. It's ideal for the imperialists. You know, ideal for the colonialists. You know, the justification is all there. If you want to look at it from the other perspective, then you have to say you question this. You know, and I actually did say once that it really worried me that Pharaoh's armies got drowned. You know, and that we ought to think about, you know, the mothers left behind in Egypt whose sons had drowned or whatever. And somebody afterwards said to me, I'd have just drowned a lot. Then she said, and don't give me any nonsense about turning the other cheek.
Oh.
So that was, I thought, a very interesting reaction.
So just a few thoughts. We got about 5 minutes, so these are the same questions we had at the very end last week. In light of your reading reflection, how would you approach them now? How do you think the Christian community should read and explain these in the future? And what other questions does your reading reflection on these passages raise for you? Any reflections on any of those three questions? And Katrine, was there anything you wanted to say? I don't want to make you talk, but I just
no, I think that I'm still trying to sort of wrap my head around sort of is related to your middle question about how to read and explain the passages in the future, because I think I'm still confused about if there is an explanation or an interpretation or something from these types of passages, like some redemptive point of having them in the Bible. Like, is there something that we're supposed to know that is true about the character of God from them? Because when we first read them, my first sort of response was that God just seems so small in them, you know, the like fearful of, you know, anyone worshiping someone different. And I feel like that feels really contradictory to a lot of the points that have now been mentioned about, you know, sharing space with others and seeing humanity in each other, which I think resonate with me a lot more. So then I think I'm just like in this tension of what I would like for Christianity to be, or like what I would like God to be, or what I would like the message of the Bible to be, versus like, why was this included? Is it something that we find categorically false, or is there something in it to learn and like something valuable?
Well, I think it is an unfolding history. You know, I mean, the Bible, it isn't just, there are moments in history which seem a bit odd, but the unfolding history is of a people who are faithless to God, and a God who is faithful to them. So you kind of have to look at these individual incidents as part of an ongoing conflict, tension between what God is wanting and how people are understanding what God is wanting. And sometimes they mess it up terribly, you know. And maybe this is just a time when they just get messed up, and doesn't lead to their domination of their land. They're always in tension with their neighbors. I mean, the Bible, you know, the Hebrew Bible is the story of this tension with neighbors all the time. warring tribes, invading armies, so that the Israelites, far from being the conquerors, are usually submissive are usually conquered in the story. They're usually the ones who are put down.
I mean, it's really difficult to find redemptive meaning in them, as you say, Katrine. I, off the top of my head, the only thing I can say, I think, that's redemptive that I see about them is if they serve as a warning to us. We read them, we realize how they've been used in the past. We realize how we still do the same today. And that's a warning to us that actually that's not what God wants. And we see that clearly in the New Testament. It's not a very satisfactory redemptive meaning to get out of them, but it's something. And I sort of hold on to that if we ignore them, then somehow we don't learn the potential lesson there is from reading them and thinking about how they have been used and how they could be used. And also, I guess this question about sharing space, that's one way of sharing space. You take it over, but there's a better way of sharing space, and that's about living together. And that's to a certain extent what, as you said, what happened in the end, in practice. Have all these high words about genocide and ethnic cleansing, but actually in practice, it looks most likely that these people just live together.
And I can't remember the bits now, but I mean there were parts, of that story of the initial adventure into Israel where they did share sometimes, and they came.
Yes.
There are some examples of them sharing and some examples of them dominating.
And the Bible is quite open about that.
Peter, would you mind if I read a poem at the end when you're finished?
No, of course.
It's when you're finished.
We nearly have. I wanted to finish with a cartoon, and clearly it did. Next week, it's where this whole process started for me, Samson, the suicide bomber. The paper I delivered on it at a conference in 2019, I think it was, 3 years ago.
Wow.
And all the questions that raised for me. So we'll think about that next week. Thank you all so much for your contributions. It's really gratifying for me sitting here and getting so many insights and thoughts and questions from you. Sue, you said you'd like to finish with a prayer, so I'll hand over to you.
No, a poem, not prayer.
A poem. Yes.
My husband wrote this. It's called The Ability of Disability. I'm a disabled person. My leg is not quite straight, and this affects my gait. So when I walk my homeward mile, the zigzag path takes quite a while. I have to cross a stile, always makes me smile. This wonky step and crooked post and craftsmanship amuse me most. I found a sixpence there, all bent and in despair, because its crooked shape had made it valueless for doing trade. I saw a cat for sale. She had a crooked tail. The price was sixpence, flat or bent, so that is where the money went. A mouse went skipping by. She gave a cheerful hi. My crooked leg makes me so slow, I cannot run from friend or foe. Come join and make us three with low mobility and zigzag slowly to my house. Myself, the cat and crooked mouse. None of the walls are straight, the chimney figure of 8. We live in cheerful harmony, each sharing her ability. Amen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Lovely.
Okay. Thanks so much, Peter, for your work. Thank you.